talks about money being like the danger of money in and of itself, right? Because it could lose all value, or not be acknowledged as being valuable by the community. And ultimately, that has happened. A state's economy through massive inflation or massive stagflation or whatever can lose value overnight. Or we can see as with something new like crypto. Like
Yeah.
crypto can, because it has nothing more, the only kind of material function you can give it is its own accounting for itself, right? Its own system of marking its own transactions, which may not be able to be described as use value, right? Um, it can suddenly be completely devalued, right? But at the same time, the dollar has gone on, remained as an abstraction, right? As something that is determined by the power of the state, right? And this only amplifies the points that Marx is making, because ultimately, um, why is the American dollar the dollar of international exchange, right? When he talks about it in the book, he's talking about, well, when we go to the world stage, when we go to the world economy, we have to return the gold to bullion, right? For this more kind of abstract form. And he gives this example of India where he points out, from in this period from the 1600s to the mid 1700s, people were wondering, how are things so cheap coming from India? How are commodities so cheap coming from India? And he finds that it was because they had buried an enormous amount of silver. I think it was like, I can't even guess. It was like 120 million pounds worth or something like that. But but his point is that this circulation, as it becomes more abstract, um, becomes more. It gives an illusion, one that Ricardo and Smith, as mentioned earlier, mistake, right? That you cannot, again, read the value from the behaviors of commodities, nor the money, nor the circulating medium in and of itself. It's only within the context of labor. But what you can read is various factors which materially make the market function. And so we list these three factors. Um, the factors are: one, movement of prices; two, the quantity of commodities; and three, the velocity of the circulating medium. So as we define the velocity of the circulating medium, this simply means how quickly exchanges are happening. And this is aided by various types of coinage or various denominations of bills, right? The quantity of commodities, the level of production, and then the movement of prices is going to be how, in relative exchanges, those commodities are valued at a given time. And so, like, there are all these relative relations, which determine whether the circulating medium, as he describes it, this mediate entity, is constant, whether there is a crisis of money, whether there is whether less things are sold or more things are sold. All the behaviors of the market are determined by these factors.
Well, and this goes into your point about India and like this burying of silver, because it's similarly replicated by the sort of proto-capitalists, right? Or you
Yes.
can look at it as like the Medicis, if you want to even talk about outside of the capitalist sphere, um, where you take gold out of the system of exchange by having it cast as a gold statue or jewelry or whatever luxury item, which is ostensibly takes the gold out of the marketplace by it being this aesthetic feature in your household or something. And the use of that is that it makes gold more valuable, right? And in ever the case that you need more gold, well, you can always just melt down the statue if that it becomes
Yes.
worth more than the statue does, right? And of course, we see with the art world today that sometimes that has the opposite effect, where the statue becomes worth more than gold because it's a
Hmm.
golden statue, right?
Yes,
And so this is the interplay that Marx is starting to observe. And again, this is all about relationships. This is not the imminent or the integral feature of money or gold or whatever it is. But he's noticing that this is a complex series of relationships. And depending on how we change our relationship to these integral parts, changes how the system works.
absolutely. And so the producer of the commodity, right? The technologist, the farmer, um, the let's just refer to them as the petty bourgeois store owner, right? Whomever, or not store owner, let's say small factory owner to be more accurate, right? Whomever uh is producing these objects now has like a new demand on them. And so um as Marx describes, um before a person can go and um you know uh ho- before they can hoard their money, right, as he describes it, before they can acquire tons of value, or before they can go out and buy tons of objects to acquire this aesthetic valence that you're describing, right? Like the Medicis, they have to wait and sell their commodities to acquire and build this hoard, right? It's an internal contradiction of the market that necessarily you have to be in stasis in one way or another, right? Until you acquire a certain amount of money, which we haven't gotten to yet. But this is sort of one of his most acute and critical observations, which is that there is this accumulation of money that is an externality to the market. So on the one hand, you have the totality of circulation, of which every commodity exchange is a part, and of which you can say there is this whole of money in circulation. But then at the same time, there is the specific function of the producer as they bring labor with them to bring value to their commodities, as they use that to acquire more money for that commodity and then put that money aside before eventually then putting that money again to buy things, but often to buy things to then gain more value, as you were describing. So, like this new contradiction where people are removing money from the market so that they can hoard it and gain more buying power, and then using that buying power to gain more control over the determinations of value within the market becomes acute.
Exactly. And he, rightly so, calls this a crisis. And I really love this quote of his because it gets to both the sort of economic crisis that we're describing, the economic
Mm-hmm.
crisis and contradiction of capitalism, but also the kind of philosophical doppelganger that exists within that crisis. He says, there is an antithesis imminent in the commodity between use value and value, between its, value it has for us and its value it's ascribed through exchange and money, between private labor, which must simultaneously manifest itself as directly social labor, and a particular concrete kind of labor which simultaneously counts as merely abstract universal labor, between the conversion of things into persons and the conversion of persons into things. And I bring this up because this is what capital is about. This is what Karl Marx is about. This is about through this process of abstraction. And I think this is important because certain maybe more one for one translations of that last sentence is uh, the personification of things and the reification of persons. And
Yes.
so in making my concrete labor right? In being a producer, I am taking that labor that has an actuality and making it abstract. And
Yes.
through making my labor abstract, I'm reificating my person.
Yeah.
My person is becoming a thing, but it's not just a one-sided process. And I think that's what a lot of people who study Marx forget. The personification I'm taking from my own concrete labor that's being abstracted and being reified is then given, whether it's to the commodity or to money, and is personifying that. That's where the fetish character comes from. It's becoming alive.
Yes. The labor becomes a value in and of itself as part of the production process, right? Because part of it in its determination of efficiency, of use of time, of scale, etc., transforms relative um, functions within the market, then turns around and changes the lives of the people who are participating in it. If one's labor is going directly to producing, as I mentioned earlier, a violin, right, and they directly and singularly relate to another person to sell that violin, then the level at which your labor is valued is quite self-determined. But when it's 100 men at a dock making sure that a vessel carrying a certain amount of things that are going to be taken to another country and sold for another uh, for another type of money, right? Suddenly, that the way that that person controls their own life is abdicated. It's taken from them. And while he doesn't make it so explicit here, it's all laid out in full, right?
Oh, completely. I mean, and he goes on to say, and he reminds us, money itself is a commodity, an external object capable of becoming the private property of any individual. So, the thing the commodity that's whose use value is supposed to be the mitigating thing to make exchanges easier is still a commodity and thus can become private property. And he says, thus the social power of your and my labor power becomes the private power of private persons.
Absolutely. And and now we're faced with it so intensely because at his time, yeah, there was the aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
There was this kind of small percentage based on familial lines and very obtuse relationships that had these kind of features. But now we have far more people and still this very small amount of a billionaire class that has more wealth than ever could be imagined. Like, of course, yes, someone can go back and look at, this Persian king or this African king that owned this amount of gold and say they were the richest person ever. But functionally, what the person has access to, the way in which they can control a percentage of the population. It's like, Jeff Bezos is like Genghis Khan, you know, who, took 200 years to kill millions of people and change the face of the earth. Now, a single person, by beginning to sell books, right, and finding a way to evaluate their relative value and meaning and power within the market, can acquire and accrue a size of social value and present an aesthetic image that is so powerful over other people that it completely transforms the way that our society functions. And that is something that is new.
Yeah,
Is
and then I think the thing that he adds to that at the sort of end of this section is this idea of, okay, so the capitalist or the baron of industry or whatever you want to call him starts hoarding this wealth, starts hoarding this value. And so what does that do? That takes gold or money or whatever you want to talk out of circulation, which makes that whether it's gold or money or whatever more valuable because there's less of it, supply and demand, right? And uses that to leverage the and not that this is new to the capitalist system, but certainly expounded upon and improved upon for the capitalist. Well, then, okay, well, I will give you this commodity for payments at a future date,
Yeah.
which in Karl Marx's mind sort of ruins the exchange value relationship
Yeah.
because uh, commodity turns into money to be then turned back into another commodity. But in this case, that commodity is given, but the money isn't returned, which is actually taking future money out of circulation, thus making their positions of accumulation and hoarding, as Karl Marx calls it, even more valuable. It
Yeah.
is essentially taking their value and exponentializing it. And you know, and it's really insidious, and you can see it now more than ever, right? With between Klarna and everything else, it's just like the idea is to put you in not only a cycle of debt, but that actually makes their money more valuable and thus gives them more power and actually takes more of your labor power and turns it into private property.
And so as private property comes to determine society, and debt, further holds the individual as they relate to the economy as a whole, you see the movement of the circulation between commodity and money, etc., become more and more broken and jutting and violent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the for the capitalist fantasy to be realized, they want the constant smooth transition from commodity to money to commodity to money. But what Marx is observing is that implicit to the mechanisms of the system, the only way that the system can grow, the only way that that commodities can be produced at scale is by hoarding, and therefore, and then using that hoarding to go buy in large amounts, creating these massive shifts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than being smooth relationships between the use value of a thing very going over to its exchange value as it would be determined by labor. That's impossible within the market, right? And I think that's something that's important to point out, that
Yeah.
that the very function of the market requires the hoarding of things, right? When the ANCAP or libertarian thinker argues about absolute property rights and removing the state and returning to this sort of neo-feudal state of things, this is what they are going to exaggerate. It's not like this is going to go away.
Well, yeah, and what they're actually promoting on accident for the, like, you know, ANCAB or anyone who's like, you know, anarcho-primitivist or any of these kind of crazy positions that one can held. But we'll see much later in Capital that the sort of urge to hoard, which Marx calls limitless. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's not like, oh, I've got this much wealth, I'm good.
I'm
But it's
good.
actually
Yeah.
something without end that only promotes more hoarding, that only promotes more centralization of wealth, then creates the need for what we call frontiers of places to extract labor at a lower cost but a higher profit. And
And at a
basically,
greater scale. Yeah.
right, and at a greater scale, and is, you know, very much part and parcel with the idea of colonialism and imperialism. and specifically in the like sort of post-industrial era, where the profit margins are much higher when labor costs are low, and so that this pushes, in order to uh, create greater there's a, we'll talk about this much later, but there's this idea of the mass of profit, right, versus the rate of profit. And in
Yeah.
order to increase both of those, but very specifically the rate of profit, you need lower labor costs. And in order to get lower labor costs, you need to seek out the frontier, where the sort of social agreed value of labor is much lower, because they don't have the kind of culturally built, well, my labor time is at least worth X, right?
Hmm.
And so we'll see, as this expands, that this becomes the curse of modernity, the curse of the world wars, the curse of imperialism, the curse of colonialism. um, and we'll follow that through the kind of arc of this book, but not to put the end before the beginning, but we're just at the beginning of this book, and this is where these sort of ideas come from, is that we are abstracting our labor, which then becomes, through the accumulation of wealth and money, the private property of someone not us,
Yes.
who has exerted very little labor. And this is the source of the inequalities and the imbalance of the world.
Yeah. And I'm very curious because, I think the last time I read this book entirely through was about a decade ago. And I am curious to
Oh, how much
see,
has
yes,
changed.
how much has changed. But I'm there throughout. Um, I the question about what the way that scarcity can function within an economy, and how, and the demand that it puts on us psychologically, um, is one that I'm interested to see Marx work out, because one thing that he is dismissing to some extent, and rightfully in most regards, is like any implicit value to like a thing like gold or a thing like diamonds or whatever. But there is clearly something about the way that the human mind functions that um, puts some type of value, and it might be completely apocalyptic, like Marx is implying, but it might also be a more ingrained tendency that you might find neural basis or something else like genetic basis, though I would not make that argument. But I, I'm curious, like, oh, give me a second.
Well, it's the idea of desire, right? And it's
Yeah.
how
Oh, sorry.
does how does desire, like, what role does desire play in all this? Because that's one of the things that in this first section Marx doesn't talk about, that
Yes.
the hoarding urge in almost all ways is an urge of desire. And you know
That's precisely the fascinating part about this, is that he is rejecting, in a way, the kind of individualist tendencies of Kant and Hegel, right, and of
mhm.
Fichte and whomever else, and also of the capitalist economist. And
Well, and
so,
and he goes into this, like, just to cut you off real quick, but
yeah,
he talks about, one of the ways in which money is developed as different from value
yeah,
is the fact that, in this line of like 20 yards of linen is worth one coat, is worth 4 gallons of brandy, is worth this amount of gold, is that okay, so gold becomes the thing that value is defined by. But it's a tautology. It's a tautology to
yes,
be like, well, a pound of gold is worth a pound of gold. Well, that's a
yeah,
meaningless statement,
yes,
right? And in doing so, he like totally eliminates the Fichtean conception of the world, right?
yes.
Like, I am equals I am is a meaningless statement.
It's a meaningless statement, absolutely. And this is where, like, when we get later into the kind of the work of Adorno and Deleuze and Nietzsche as well, right? But particularly in this antagonism and synthesis that I imagine between Adorno and Deleuze, where the function of human desire becomes so important, because for Deleuze, desire has become, due to commodity fetish and due to the human as commodity, labor as commodity, and their lives as commodity, have become part of these massive circuits, as Marx will come to describe the mediate process in Capital Two. Desire it becomes an entity in and of itself, a reified power in and of itself that consumes and transforms our society, right? And and for Adorno, right, desire it doesn't have the same impact on things, because will doesn't have the same impact on things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we are largely determined by these forces that Marx is outlining. And really, it becomes a matter of reading. Like, where does Marx place the individual's implicit tendencies in the production of these structures? Or is it largely accidental that we have tended towards this system of greed? Did it just happen to come out of the particular historical conditions of feudalism and end up as it is? Or is there an actual degree of, I want to resist calling it fate, but are there forces within the human as a species that have produced these accumulative hoarding tendencies?
Well, right, and this is like totally jumping the horse, but like that's not a phrase, but jumping the
Jumping the
shark.
horse,
Um,
jumping
but
the gun,
this is the thing, right? It's like,
putting the
and
cart
and we'll
before the horse.
see this in Marx. It's like, or maybe even beyond Marx, but like Marxism and Leninism and these things, is that the development of these tendencies are necessary for the development of the next stage of humanity, or the next um, social arrangement, shall we say.
Yes.
But sort of in the idea of historical materialism or something, that you kind of have to pass through these standards of time that then allow the appropriate conditions to then move beyond them. And so in that sense, this study of capital is important, because if you do believe in that, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, belief's a funny thing, I don't know, but it's you can't get through until you understand what you're in. And that's what this book is about. This book is about understanding what the hell is capitalism, how does it work, and that's why he starts the book with the commodity, because it's the
Yeah.
lowest common denominator of what separates a capitalist society from a feudal one, or from some kind of ancient or indigenous, socially self-sufficient sort of society. And then that is the fact that our society is run on the exchange of commodities. And so what does that mean? What the hell is a commodity? What makes a commodity? How does it work? That's what
And
this book is about.
absolutely. And I think this comes full circle back to the beginning and this question of nature and this relationship
Mm-hmm.
between, like, the
Mm-hmm.
idealist dialectic and the materialist dialectic that we were working on last episode, which is that, for Hegel, right, in the serial stages of the dialectic, as it transcends, right, or as it imminently produces out of itself these sort of serial moments of transcendence, right, contained within each stage is the last stage, right? And so there's this sort of intimation of this kind of historical power, right? But it's largely ideal, right? You imagine that, like, the ideas of the past are carried within the people of now, but this person over there doesn't have access to this knowledge and this person does, right? And so in their actual stages of knowledge, it isn't so universal, right? He's more essentially, to go back to the question that Zizek comes to.
Hmm.
He's both talking about this kind of mystified movement towards freedom, but also is describing the mystified cyclic processes by which capitalism reproduces itself. Um, but with Marx, um, there starts to become a more genuine sense of what one would mean by freedom, right? Because whether we're talking about the capitalists and the choices of the market, whether we're talking about the kind of liberal ideals of the state and the idea that democracy brings freedom, right? Or the philosophical concept of Hegel, where a person kind of frees themselves through reaching a greater understanding and therefore produces a society of greater understanding. Now we see the reason why there is a negative, right? The reason why there isn't, there hasn't already been the realization of this higher, greater force, because actual organizations of society do not work out in that way. And in that regard, Marx does show that there's an evolution to human behavior, a dynamics of human behavior, but there's also an implicit sort of domination of other people within that. Next time, we're going to be going into part 2 of Capital. Marx starts to get more specifically into the labor process, into exploitation, into alienation, which Hegel touched on earlier, as well as his concept of valorization and his ideas on the working day, which are extremely influential to both Marxism in general and post-Marxist thought, but also I would say our general understanding of like critique of capitalist life and life under liberalism.
Well,
And it's
and
really
sometimes
exciting.
I feel like Marx just like screwed us all over because like as much as liberal economists hate Marx, I mean, he describes our life. So,
Yes.
so take that as you will. But yeah, so we'll be dealing with those topics, and really the like general thrust is we went through this process of describing trade of commodities, of use value versus exchange value, the development of money. And this next section is really going to take us from money to capital, to what makes capitalism different than other forms of economies that have existed, throughout throughout time. So um, we're really getting to the meat of the book next
And
time.
I think and since we're going to be going through this book in whole, it's important to get some of these technical elements down because there's a way in which Marx has been also rendered inert as a commodity, right? Like,
Totally, yeah.
we've mentioned it before in jest, but there was the photo shoot of Grimes. I think it was she'd had a child sometime before with Elon Musk, and she's
They
really
had just split up,
they
and
just split up. That's correct.
yeah, and she's
And
dressed in that like funny neo-futurist
yeah,
thing and reading. What was she
not
reading? Was she
it was
reading
Communist
Communist
Manifesto,
Manifesto? Yeah,
and
because
it's
she
like
wouldn't carry around
sitting
a
on the ground, sitting
10,000
on the
page book.
ground at some point. But like that has happened to Marx, and if there's anything that because we can't say the same thing about Kant and Hegel. People just don't give a fuck about Kant and Hegel. There aren't people screaming on Fox News about Hegel.
Right,
Or
right. And if they were, they might be like, well, please just listen to Hegel or not,
yeah, 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 yeah,
and Trump
absolutely.
should be king, and.
Yeah, I mean, you have the Ben Shapiro types who will, go back to Aristotle, or some weirdo like Tim Pool who will obliquely reference John Stuart Mill, who Marx just eviscerates in this book, which makes me so fucking happy.
He really
Like,
did. We'll
like,
try and give you a little snippet of it in the credits because it's
yeah,
fun.
yeah, yeah. But ultimately, uh, we need to get these details down because, in his work towards freedom, even where he makes mistakes, we can work towards freedom, right?
Well, right. That's isn't that the aim of this is
Absolutely.
freedom?
Yeah, and I think it's the aim of text of the matter, right? Is to like work towards a little bit of freedom through kind of the engagement with these important works. And Marx is an exemplar of that. And so it's going to be real fun.
Cue pretty American flag with an eagle flying past. Freedom. But in all seriousness, that I think is our aim, and we appreciate you guys tuning in. This has been Text of the Matter. This is part one of Capital, 3.1, you can call it, of our kind of series of German idealism and bringing us to the current day. But thank you all for tuning in. We have a Patreon if you want to support us. You can find that at patreon.com or whatever the fuck it is, just like Text of the Matter. Find us on YouTube. Please follow us. A New Brand is our channel. And we're also on Twitter and Instagram and sort of on Facebook.
Spotify, we have a Facebook group.
Yeah, and if you're not into videos, we all our shit gets posted to Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. So please listen that way if that's easier for you. And hiya on that note.
Audi, my Marxist babies. Later.
Bye bye.